Can you raise bilingual kids as non-native speakers of the target language? Yes, you can. I know because I've done it. In today's video, I'll explain why it's definitely possible to raise your kids to speak an additional language, even if you're not a native speaker of the target language. I'll share with you some real-life success stories of parents who have done just that. Keep watching. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to explore a topic that, as I've recently found out, is highly relevant to many families out there. Yes, we'll discuss whether it's possible to raise your child to speak a language when you're not a native speaker of that language. Before we get started, please consider subscribing to this channel and don't forget to hit that like button if you find the content helpful. This will massively help other people like you find us. Thank you. Okay, let's dive in. So, to answer that question as to whether it's possible to raise your child to speak a language when you're not a native speaker of that language, my answer is simple. It is a resounding yes. Why? I know it's possible, not least because I've done it myself. Those of you who have watched my videos, read my blog posts or my book, would probably know that my husband and I are raising our children to be trilingual in Mandarin, Russian and English while living in the UK. But many of you might not know that I am in fact not a native Mandarin speaker. While I was born in Shanghai, China, I grew up in Hong Kong, and I consider my mother tongue to be Cantonese, which is a Chinese dialect spoken in Hong Kong and the surrounding region. Without going into too much detail here, Cantonese and Mandarin are as different to each other as Spanish and Italian. By the way, in mainland China, a significant proportion of people are bilingual in the sense that they speak Mandarin and their local dialect, which is often as different to Mandarin as Cantonese is to Mandarin. Anyway, that's an entirely different topic, but going back to my point. I am fluent in Mandarin but do not consider myself to be a native speaker of that language. Yet I have been raising my two kids to speak Mandarin and I speak to them exclusively in that language. And the result? They can both communicate in Mandarin just fine. I always thought that what we did was pretty unusual. The orthodox advice from experts is to speak to your child in your mother tongue or your strongest language, the assumption being that these two usually coincide. However, it was only this year, in 2023, that I realized how many families worldwide are in fact doing exactly what we are doing, i.e. raising their children to speak a language as non-native speakers. When my old friend from Hong Kong was visiting earlier this year, I saw that she made a considerable effort to speak to her toddler in English in addition to Cantonese. My friend told me that it is now extremely common for young middle-class families in Hong Kong to attempt to raise their children to be bilingual in Cantonese and English. According to my friend, even parents who don't speak the best English would try to do this at home, in the hope of giving their children an advantage. I was pretty astonished when she told me this, as this was certainly not a thing when I was growing up in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong parents are far from alone in this. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of meeting a group of super dedicated Italian mums who are all raising their children to be bilingual in Italian and English as non-native speakers. A common theme that emerged was that these mums felt like the mainstream education system in Italy does not teach English well, but they, as parents, want to give their kids an advantage and give them more opportunities by helping them gain fluency in English. This Q&A session really opened my eyes to a whole new parenting world. I guess living in an English-speaking country, I just never quite imagined how much value is placed on English language skills worldwide. And I'm pretty sure that this phenomenon extends well beyond Hong Kong and Italy. There must be so many families out there trying to do the same around the world. And the purpose of this video is that I really want to encourage and empower these families by reassuring you that your goal is absolutely attainable, despite what many experts say. As I mentioned earlier, the prevailing wisdom is that you should always speak to your child in your most proficient language, which is usually your mother tongue. However, I personally do not agree with this purist approach. My approach is that if you are genuinely fluent in the target language, and again, there are so many definitions of fluency that the whole concept is actually quite fuzzy. There's no reason you can't speak to your child in that language. The purpose of language is ultimately effective communication. If you are fluent enough to achieve that, you are fluent enough to speak that language with your child. I totally understand where these experts are coming from. But personally, I find this purist approach quite limiting and even maybe somewhat elitist and even condescending. Because by this logic, if you and your partner are from the same culture, same country, speak the same language, and you live in a largely monolingual society, as in the case in Hong Kong and Italy, you and your partner should just accept that and speak to your child in the local language only. Of course, in reality, that's exactly what the vast majority of people do, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I think that there's equally nothing wrong with parents wanting to do something different with their child. There are many reasons why parents may want to do that. They may want better career prospects for their kids. They may want to help their children develop their brain in a different way, as bilingualism is shown to have amazing benefits for your brain, as I have discussed in a separate video. The link is in the description box below if you are interested. They may simply want their children to be able to communicate with more people outside of their own country. And why should these parents be made to feel like what they're doing is somehow wrong or unnatural? This actually reminds me of something really random. I remember reading War and Peace, and there was this passage where Pierre, the main protagonist, criticizes other Russian families for speaking to their children in French, which was the norm among the Russian nobility at the time. He vows never to do that with his own kids. Well, it's easy for him to take that position because, of course, his French governors would do that job for him. Well, all the other families probably had their own French governesses too. I digress. As I said, it is a really random example, but my point is that not all of us have the privilege of paying someone to raise our kids to be bilingual or trilingual. But as parents, many of us still want our kids to enjoy the benefits that being fluent in more than one language brings. I know that some people in this situation are worried about lots of things like what their child's accent might sound like. Okay, your child's accent might not be perfect. I'll be the first to admit that my children have a bit of a funny accent when they speak Mandarin and English and Russian. I've even made a separate video about this whole accent thing. The link is in the description box below if you're interested. But is it not better to speak a language fluently with a slight accent than not to be able to speak it at all? And for children, such accents will most likely not be permanent anyway. So my point is this: focus on fluency and don't sweat over relatively minor details like accent. In my next video, I'll dive deeper into the how-to aspect of raising your child to be bilingual as a non-native speaker. But in this video, I want to share with you some real-life success stories to give you inspiration and motivation. A few years ago, I met a little girl at our local library in London who was talking to a Chinese nanny in Mandarin. The nanny and I got chatting, and what she told me was quite surprising. The little girl was the daughter of a local politician of South Asian origins who was married to an Englishman. The mother spoke to the child in her native language, and the English father spoke to her in Mandarin. He learned the language as an adult and became fluent after spending some time in China. He was determined to raise his daughter to be trilingual and started speaking to her in Mandarin exclusively from birth. The nanny herself was also technically a non-native speaker. Like me, she's a Hong Konger who is fluent in Mandarin. From my brief interaction with the little girl, I would say that while her Chinese wasn't perfect, she could certainly express herself adequately for her age. It just shows that you do not have to be a native speaker of the target language to succeed. What you do need is lots of determination. A few months later, I actually ran into the little girl again at a supermarket and saw her with her dad. Just as the nanny said, he was speaking to her in Mandarin. It would not surprise me if he, got the occasional comment from others every now and then, but he persevered and it worked. Let me share with you another example. When my daughter was still a baby, I met a mum at a local baby group who always spoke to her daughter in Spanish. I always assumed that the mum was Spanish, but when I bumped into her again at my daughter's nursery one day, I discovered she's actually fully British born and bred, and so is her husband. In a subsequent conversation, she told me that she came from a tiny English town where everyone only spoke English. She studied Spanish at university and spent lots of time in Spain. Being fluent in the language and now living in a wonderfully cosmopolitan part of London, she thought it would be a great idea to raise her daughter to be bilingual. I asked her if she sometimes found it challenging, and she said that yes, there were times when she wasn't sure what a word was in Spanish, but on the whole, she still thought it was doable and certainly rewarding. She was absolutely convinced that the potential benefits far outweighed the negatives. And once her daughter was a bit older, it could be fun to look words up together. In conclusion, I think parents in this situation might even have an advantage that works in their favor. You are probably extremely committed and dedicated to this goal and are prepared to work extra hard to compensate for the fact that you are not a native speaker. Because dedication and perseverance are the key to success in raising your child to be bilingual or trilingual or multilingual. Just as being a native speaker of the target language by no means guarantees that you can pass your language on to your child, being a non-native speaker does not doom you to failure. Far from it. By using the right techniques and applying them consistently, you can succeed. In my next video, I'll give some practical tips and advice on how to raise your child to speak a language when you're not a native speaker yourself. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe so that you won't miss the next video. And don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this video. Thank you guys. 谢谢, spasiba. See you next time.